Hello, BookTube. Today I want to talk about a formative book in my adult life, and that would be David Benatar's Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence. When I was a graduate student in philosophy, I was in the depths of my dissertation, getting close to the end. But anybody who's done a dissertation knows it's rough. It's rough. Now I'm not going to sit here and play the pity game. There are billions of people who have it way worse than me, right? Um, just saying that you beat a dead horse to death, right? For the dissertation, and so the story about this book is completely unrelated to my dissertation. My dissertation is in what some would probably call boring old analytic epistemology. Riveting stuff. I mean, I like it, but I needed a kind of philosophical palate cleanser, as it were, because I was reading this stuff on the same topic, over and over, and I was writing and submitting chapters to my advisor, etc., etc. So one day, my office mate, and also my best friend, and he's remained my best friend. I'm not going to name him because I don't think he wants to be named, but he'll see this and you know who you are. One day, he needed a book from the library. He does ancient philosophy, which I'm woefully ill equipped to talk about. It's one of my philosophical blind spots. I will admit it. So anyway, we go over to the library. I tagged along with him. I think he would give me a ride home. I don't know. It doesn't matter. I don't want this to be some old man talking like, okay. And I just stumbled upon this book. I just stumbled upon a hardcover library copy of this book, and it was Better Never to Have Been. I saw. I'm like, really? The harm of coming into existence. That's intriguing. And I checked it out of the library. And it was phenomenal. It was one of the few philosophical texts that it's going to sound, anybody familiar with philosophy is going to think this is crazy. It's one of the few texts and viewpoints that I thought there's no good argument against this. And I challenge you. By all means, in the comments section, challenge me. I want to see some weaknesses. But I was taken in by it. Immediately taken in by it. Probably because of the style. The style that most people, I would guess on BookTube, that read philosophy or popular philosophy, they would probably fall more into the camp of people that do continental. Nietzsche, Heidegger, Foucault, Derrida, Hegel. That's one camp, and that's a camp that I'm largely ignorant of. My camp is analytic philosophy, which, to kind of put it, how do I put it? To put it bluntly, it's logic pedantry. And it's trying to turn all philosophical disciplines in some way into a branch of logic. Now, that's hyperbole, but there's a certain rigor there. There's an attempted clarity of language, a real attempted clarity of language. in the best of the text. Now, I will say, and I don't mean this to be too much of a diatribe, you can accuse my side, and I have, of obfuscation. So one can accuse continental philosophy of obfuscation in terms of the way that they word things in very complicated, convoluted 20 syllable words, right? That it's hard to parse out what they mean. And okay, but you can get lost in the sauce with a lot of analytic philosophy, with logic pedantry, just these syllogisms and formal, translating things into formal language, and it's got all the usual trappings of it can have all the usual trappings of obfuscation. And there are some academic, socio-political reasons for that in academia, which I won't get into here. Now, I haven't even told you what the book is about. The book is a defense of the position of antinatalism. And antinatalism, broadly speaking, is the view that it is immoral to create sentient life. That's what it is. It's immoral to create new sentient life. This is not unique to Benatar. He is not the founder of it. This goes back a long ways. You can find it in the Arab world. You can even find it in some Christian sects. Before Benatar, some famous proprietors of this view or developers of this view were Arthur Schopenhauer, which many know. Far less people know about Peter Vesselzoff. And there's a whole bunch of others. So Benatar is not the first. But he spoke to me in a way that a lot of the others wouldn't, because of his philosophical rigor, his rigor of argumentation. And there's one warning I will give about this book. If your mind is open, that is to say, if you don't just see this and go, oh, that's bullshit. Never to, that's bullshit. Of course it's better, life is great. It's wonderful to be born. If you don't have that reflexive dismissal and you allow Benatar in, I don't mean this to sound mystical, but if you allow him in, he's going to move some furniture around, to borrow a phrase from Steve Donahue. Let me kind of tell you a little bit. I'm not going to go through the arguments. That would take a long time. I've taught classes where this was a unit, and I carried on at length about I think we covered 3 of the chapters, and I carried on at length for 2 to 3 hours each on each chapter. So I'm not going to do that to you here. I'm just going to give you kind of a rough overview. So you have the introduction, which is kind of, talks about antinatalism and kind of like a pro-natal bias. Now, I will say this. If you read this, it might be a little bit outdated, only because from my last recollection, Gen Z, by and large, is having vastly fewer children. And they vastly and they overwhelmingly, from my experience, right? Like I would have to see more studies, but from the research I've seen and the Zoomers I've talked to, they're not doomers necessarily, but they know the world is kind of a shithole, for lack of a better word. They've looked around, they've gazed at the sea of suffering and unmitigating misery that surrounds them, and they're like, nah, no. I'm not saying that this is a refined kind of antinatalism, but it is a notion that the tides are kind of changing, that people are kind of waking up to the horrors of existence, the cascade of nightmares that befalls every single person, that's inescapable no matter how good your life is. And so, the outdated part in here is Benatar seems to think that, and again, this was written, what was it, 2005? Should have looked beforehand. Well, the paperback is in 2005. Oh no, first published 2006 rather. Sorry. So maybe back then, right? Back then, seemed things a little bit more hopeful. So if you read this, just be on guard for that. That he kind of peddles a notion of, well, people tend to view things more positively than they actually are, and I'm not so clear that that's the case. Even when I was teaching students, back in, like, when I was teaching students, even back in like 2017, 18, and I was teaching this, but even then I would say, hey, don't you have this kind of bias that you remember the good things over the bad, as you are sort of predisposed to those kinds of memories, to kind of hold on to those. And they were like, no. I was like, really? Okay. So, then he talks about why coming into existence is always a harm. That's chapter 2. And then he talks about, in chapter 3, how, he asks the question, how bad is coming into existence? Very bad, he's going to say. And he makes a fun, he employs an excellent argument strategy here, right? Whether you agree with it or not, it's an excellent argument strategy in that he says, look, okay, listen, here are several theories of the good life, right? Presumably we would all want our children or the human species, unless we're just unrepentant, unless we're just these kind of raging assholes, we want what's best for people, right? I would think that unless you're a complete fucking asshole, you want what's best for people. And so you want not just yourself to have a quality of, a good quality of life, whatever that might be, but also everybody else, right? Maybe you have exceptions if you're petty or whatever, but you get my point. And so he takes on these three or four theories and says, listen, on all of these, coming into existence is a net harm. Now, I'm grossly oversimplifying this because I'm not giving the whole all the arguments here. Chapter 4, then he talks about the antinatalist view. What is the antinatalist view? And he goes into great detail. Now, those are excellent in establishing, in my opinion, the sort of the baseline view. But my favorite chapters are besides the conclusion, chapters 5 and 6. So 5 is called Abortion, the Pro-Death View. And what he says there is, okay, listen, when does a fetus become a person? Well, okay, but we don't really, there's, yeah, okay, but up to a certain, before a certain point, we can all agree, unless we're some kind of like a religious whack job, that that's not a person. And the interesting thing about Benatar, and what kind of made, perked me and helped kind of move some of the furniture in my head, was his view isn't just a pro-choice view, which is a view of it's a woman's right to choose whether she wants to continue to carry the fetus to term or not. He says you ought to have an abortion before a certain time period, before a certain point in gestation. You should have an abortion, a moral ought, right? That's wild to me. I have to admit I like that view, um, but that's a wild view. Okay, and the other one, and this is where I think that there's some, you can really dig into it, which is population and extinction. And I wish he had devoted more time to this section, but he kind of gestures vaguely at, well, we want to reduce suffering. That's the whole point of the antinatalist view. I'm not sure if I made that clear in the beginning. If not, I apologize. But the whole point is harm reduction and suffering reduction. I think that that's a plausible moral principle that all of us can get on board with. Now, the friend that I mentioned earlier, him and I fight quite a bit over this. Um, I call him a moral pervert. You know who you are. It's all in good fun, though, right? As philosophers, we beat each other up. It's just the name of the game. Anyway, I'm getting lost on a tangent again. The problem is, if, let's just hypothetically say everybody stopped producing new offspring, who would take care of the old people? Eventually it would just be old people, and they would sort of suffer and die horrendous deaths, right? And so Benatar seems to suggest a kind of like phased extinction, which seems to be, or seems to conflict with his notion you ought not have kids. Because in phased extinction, you're having less and less kids, and you're sort of winding down, right? You're sort of winding down. Well, but in the winding down, that implies that you still need to have people to have, you still need to use other people to create new people, which if you read the previous chapters, you ought not do. So this is these two chapters, 5 and 6, while I think Benatar would say those aren't the most important, that the first 3 chapters, or that's where like the substance, like the real substance is, I like those ones. And this book, it formed, how do I put it? It made me feel less alone. I've always had a depressive outlook on life, kind of like a dreary, depressive outlook on life, pessimistic, and whatnot. And I always thought, and there was always an itch in the back of my mind that having kids was not good. But I didn't have it fleshed out. I didn't have a coherent philosophical framework for that. It was just something like, I don't think I want to have kids. And I don't want to have kids because the world's kind of a bad place. It's kind of a rotten, horrible place, right? Why would I want to subject somebody to that, right? And Benatar, right? He gave me the language. He gave me the language and the arguments to make sense of what I was thinking. I will say, as a kind of a cautionary tale, if you dig into it, Benatar is going to make explicit to you just how bad life is in ways that you hadn't considered, that you had maybe repressed or gotten used to. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. And so I don't want to do what the people do about, taking the red pill or the blue pill, because the whole red pill thing has been co-opted by dipshits, right? But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I would be lying if I told you there were times I wish I hadn't seen it. There's going to be several books I recommend where, on the one hand, I'm glad that I learned about it, but on the other, I wish I didn't. I wish I hadn't seen that. I wish I hadn't read that. I mean, this book, in my opinion, is the true definition of like a dangerous book. If I can even go so far as to call it that, would be a dangerous book. Not because it has swearing in it, or because it's got racial epitaphs in it, or because it's culturally insensitive, or any of that weak shit, right? Or, how some people talk about, this book traumatized me. What the fuck are you talking about? Or, this book broke me. And it's like, this book, Better Never to Have Been, would be the book equivalent of witnessing a genocide in real time. That sounds extreme, and maybe it's a little bit too extreme. I don't know how else to explain it. And I know I'm repeating myself quite a bit. I'm trying to find the correct words. So I would say, listen, if you want to continue to have a wonderful, sort of rosy-colored view of the world, probably don't read Better Never to Have Been. But if you're like most people, and you see something provocative or shocking and you can't look away, just like when we all drive down the road, if we see a car accident, we're all slowing down, right? We're all slowing down to see if there are any, bodies. And if we're honest with ourselves, our worst angels hope that there's like a severed head or something. We don't like to admit that, but come on, right? We all kind of hope that. We don't hope there's a car crash, but if there is, okay, I think I made the point. I'm going to wrap that up. This is just one of the books that had a massive impact. Obviously, every book I read has some kind of an impact, but obviously some have way more than others, obviously, right? And there's just a handful of books that have just lingered with me over and over, and on and on and on and on. From childhood to middle school to teens, through college, through graduate school, I have kind of these sort of benchmark books that really hit me in the best ways, and also in some dangerous ways. So yeah, again, I would highly recommend Better Never to Have Been, but proceed with caution. Okay, that's what I got for you. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate all the support, and again, I want to shout out Steve Donahue. He was gracious enough to tag me in one of his videos, and because of that, there are more eyeballs on this channel. So thank you. Thank you, fine sir. You are a scholar and a gentleman. All right, and with that, I'm going to sign off. Peace.